And hello, YouTube. This is Thomas Judge back once again with another installment of my ongoing series chronicling my retro gaming emulation journey. We're over halfway through now. This is video 11, which is talking about how to refine ROMs to make the ultimate ROM collection. This series isn't going to be a technical guide of how to do all the things that I've learned. It is, however, a chronicle of my journey of how I did it, how I learned to learn, how I learned to fuck around and find out. Um, and above all, this is just kind of showing my own tips, things that I learned, notes that I made myself, stuff that wasn't really discussed elsewhere online, and it's to provide the kind of content that I wish had been around when I first started this journey a few years ago. Quick disclaimer, I won't be providing links to any ROM sites whatsoever at all in the series. And with that out of the way, let's dive straight into it. Refining ROMs and curating your ROM library is often a bit of an obsession with retro game enthusiasts. There's a bit of an ongoing joke in retro gaming that you spend more time curating your ROM library than you do actually playing your games and playing your retro games. And there's an aspect of that which is true and kind of hits hard. That said, it is really important to curate your ROM library. And when doing so, there's a certain number of reasons and certain principles to keep in mind. Firstly, it's really good to keep it as lean as possible because games take up memory, and memory is a valuable resource on your hardware or on your SD cards. As such, there's a couple of general principles to keep in mind. Firstly, you want as few duplicate ROMs as possible. Why would you have multiple identical versions of the same game across different systems? Obviously, if you're particularly a massive fan of a particular franchise and you want every conceivable version, yeah, sure, that's absolutely fine. But is that true for every single game which has ever had a duplicate release? The second point to keep in mind is that games are often re-released from one system to the next and the next generation, and these remasters or updates have their own pros and cons, as per the next point. It's tricky to know which version of a game, when released, to go for. Within one console generation, a game can easily be multi-platform, so which one should you choose and why? Across gaming generations, sometimes the ones in the later, technically more powerful generations might lack some of the quirks and some of the features that actually you got nostalgic affection for. So it is worth thinking through which ones you keep and which ones you don't. Finally, I would strongly recommend converting all the applicable ROMs that can be converted to CHD format to CHD format. There's an early video in this series talking about different file formats. I think it's video 2 or 3 or something like that. And essentially, I would really strongly recommend doing that. You can save hundreds of gigs in your collection just by converting ROMs from the original format to a CHD format. So now we're going to talk through the different systems, and my guidance per system or per comparison is as follows. Final burn or main. So these are two different types of arcade ROM set, and the question really is which particular arcade ROM should you keep? It's not uncommon to have a game that's available on the main ROM set and also available on Final Burn. So let's take a classic like 1941, for example. I personally tend to keep a game even if I have it in each folder, and the reason is because arcade emulation is tricky. There's so much confusing stuff around MAME conversion and compatibility that I don't really refine between these two ROM libraries. You never know what you might need on a particular setup, to be honest. Also, the files are also very, very small, so it's not really a material deal to trim down between these two consoles. Now, between Neo Geo and Neo CD, there is some important distinctions to make. The ROMs for Neo Geo arcade emulation are small zip folders, 4 or 5 meg. Neo CD are large CHD files that can be easily 150 or 200 meg. The thing is, the games are identical. The only difference is that Neo CD has a CD quality soundtrack. In my opinion, this difference is simply not worth the massive difference in file size. Like I said, a Neo CD can easily be 20 times the size of a zipped counterpart. As a result, I ended up deleting all of my Neo CD games. The next question is to have things either on NES or Master System. Now, a lot of games for these systems are unique, but there is a fair smattering of ones that are identical ports in every way on each of these consoles. For these, all I'd recommend is simply picking your console of choice I grew up with Sega, so whenever a game came up that's identical across NES or Master System, I just kept the Master System ROM and I deleted the NES ROM. Speaking of Sega, there's often a bit of a debate between Genesis ROMs, or rather Mega Drive ROMs, and 32X ROMs or Sega CD ROMs. There were quite a few games that were released on more than one of these systems. In most cases, the only difference is that the Sega CD or the 32X version had better audio. Again, this is at the cost of massive increases in file size. Personally, I chose to delete these larger versions and keep the basic Genesis or Mega Drive ROM. If you're an audiophile, you might want to keep the later release and delete the original Genesis ROM. Be warned, however, the increased space you will need for the larger ROMs is significant. In terms of Mega Drive or Genesis, it's important to compare that to SNES as well. A lot of games for this 16-bit generation are unique, but again, there's a fair smattering of ones that are identical ports in every way. Again, I would still recommend picking your console of choice. And again, for me, I grew up with Sega, so whenever a game came up that's identical across both, I did keep the Genesis or Mega Drive ROM. Now, the tricky part about this particular generation is that whilst many games were identical across both systems, there were also many games that had the same name and were released at the same time but were completely different. Disney's Aladdin is a good example. The SNES version and the Mega Drive version were made by completely different companies making completely different games. In other cases, the version differences are minor, an extra level here, an extra character there. So you should consider for yourself whether or not you want every variation of a particular game in a particular case. Again, note the ROM sizes here are very small, so it's easy to just keep all the slightly different versions if you want. To give you a slightly quirky example of my own, I deleted the game Joe and Mac from the Mega Drive, but I kept it on the SNES, even though the Mega Drive version and the SNES version are identical. And the reason I did that is because the two sequels to Joe and Mac, Joe and Mac 2, Joe and Mac 3, were SNES exclusive, so they weren't on the Mega Drive. And I just felt like having all three of them on the same console. So I broke my own rule for that one, and that's totally fine. When it comes to a Thomas Wave, Naomi, or Dreamcast, it's common to group these three consoles together largely for discussions. The reason is they all kind of use the same architecture. Um, so, as you may have seen in the previous video, they all work on the same Dreamcast emulator. Now, most Thomas Wave games were unique, but some of them, like for example Guilty Gear, were also released on the Dreamcast. The majority of the Naomi library is also on the Dreamcast. Now, that's got pros and cons. Generally, the Atomis Wave and Naomi ROMs are smaller than Dreamcast CHDs, but some Naomi ROMs do require large CHD files with them to work, and these require very fiddly renaming, which I covered several videos ago. Similarly, some emulators find it tricky to emulate the two arcade systems, Atomis Wave and Naomi, as they require the functionality to enter a coin or enter a credit. Again, I talked about that on the last video about emulating that on a Retroid Pocket and having to reconfigure controller configurations to make that work. That said, using the arcade games allow you to coin feed a game to simply hammer through it. You can just keep on adding credit, adding credit, adding credit. So no matter how hard you're finding the game or how often you're dying, you can just power through it no matter what. However, the more console-like experience on the Dreamcast means that you get a limited number of continues, and then you die and there's game over and you have to start again. Um, As such, it's kind of a toss-up whether or not you prefer to have the arcadey experience or the Dreamcast console experience, simply because, as I say, the Thomas Wave and Naomi can be a bit fiddly to configure and set up with the renaming and so on, but they can be easier. You can just power through and pretend you have infinite money to just keep on feeding the machine. It is worth noting Dreamcast ROMs have the added benefit of being very easy to organize. There's no need for linked CHDs as you get with Naomi games or things like that. When it comes to the next generation up, you've got the comparison between PS1, Saturn, or Nintendo 64. Now, many games are released across both systems and were basically identical at least PS1 and Saturn, and often even with N64. In all of those cases, I always go for the PS1 version because it's much easier to emulate and much easier for the controller to be a default. Saturn emulation is generally way more taxing than PS1 emulation, so it's more likely your hardware will struggle with it in some way. That's just the nature of the way the Saturn's internal architecture was. As a result, PS1 ROMs are therefore much more versatile. They're usable on lower end devices as well as the higher end ones you need for the Sega Saturn. To give you an example, this then meant that I deleted Wipeout 1 and Wipeout 2097 from my Saturn ROM folder because I had it on the PS1 and it's just much easier to play at a high level of fidelity from the PS1. Similarly, all N64 games will require the unique control system of a Nintendo 64, and emulating this on any kind of normal controller means remapping buttons and can be both fiddly and unsatisfying. However, if a game is available as a PS1 version, then just stick to that. It's got more orthodox controls, and to be honest, I only limit myself to N64 exclusives in my N64 ROM library. Even with these exclusives, you might run into issues. Some third-party controllers don't accept the inputs correctly, meaning they don't work great. Um, Fortunately, quite a few so-called N64 exclusives are actually emulated in tiers 3 or 4 of my ROM library. For example, Perfect Dark and Banjo-Kazooie are on Xbox Live Arcade, and Mario 64 is available in loads of places, including the Nintendo DS, which is actually tier 2 and quite easy to emulate. That said, as these games cross tiers, it's worth keeping both ROMs as you never know how powerful your given device will be, and you might want to give it a chance at a lower level of power. The only real benefit to an N64 ROM, other than its complete exclusivity for the games that are exclusives, is that it's about a tenth the size of a PS1 or a Saturn equivalent. Next up, we have the conversation about a PSP versus a PS2. Now, many PSP and PS2 games are virtually identical, so look at the Prince of Persia games, for example. Yet the PSP version can often be played on much lower powered hardware that simply can't handle the PS2. This is weird but useful. In these cases, I keep both versions, as the PSP version of a game is good in something like the Retroid, while the slightly better PS2 version can go into something like my Steam Deck. The same is insanely true of games that actually had PS3 versions too, like Split Second Velocity. A few videos ago, I talked through my entire ROM library and I was sharing the folder structure and so on. And you will have noted that I have a whole section of my ROM library of things that I don't actually have on any given device at any given time. And one of those folders was PS2 games that are available on PSP. And so I've kept those ROMs, but I haven't actually installed them on anything in particular. Next up, we have the PS2 generation, or rather PS2 versus GameCube versus Xbox. Again, many games are unique to a specific console, but where they're multi-platform, the choice is clear. PS2 wins hands down. GameCube games are generally slightly inferior graphically, as well as having the same weird controller issue we saw in N64 games. There are still absolute gems on this system. The Metal Gear Solid version there is probably better than the PS2 version, for example. But when a game is functionally identical with no extra features on GameCube, stick with PS2. So for example, the game Future Tactics Uprising, I have that on PS2 and I deleted the GameCube ROM. Xbox is another level of emulation, literally. It's in our tier 4 of our ROM library, unlike the other two systems which are both tier 3, and so generally you want the PS2 version of any multi-system game unless there's a reason to go Xbox. Soul Calibur, Soul Calibur 2 is a good example. The Xbox version has Spawn as a unique character not available on the PS2 or GameCube versions. Whilst you can play Soul Calibur 2 on PS2 or GameCube on relatively weak systems, the Xbox version, however, requires something like a Steam Deck or a PC. In terms of Xbox ROMs, quick pro tip, try to get US versions of these ROMs as opposed to European ones. You'll see why in video 16. On to the next generation, Xbox 360 or PS3. The winner here is again straightforward. PS3 wins hands down. PS3 emulation is far from perfect, but the system is far easier to emulate than either of its two competitors. Xbox 360 emulation, even on Steam Deck, is essentially not possible. I would still recommend dumping the ROMs of 360 exclusives, as one day they will definitely be emulatable, but not yet. If a game you like is on both PS3 and 360, go PS3 all the way. There is some irony in this, in that Xbox has much better game compatibility or game emulation on their official hardware. But as we discussed a few videos ago, that's kind of a false kind of emulation. That's software emulation as opposed to hardware emulation. And so whilst the PlayStation ecosystem finds it much harder to emulate PS3, the emulation community finds it much easier. Something to add about PS3 emulation is that if something has been re-released on either of these, actually, Xbox 360 or PS3, as an HD version, I'd recommend not getting it. Just get the original. For example, you could play the Jak and Daxter trilogy on PS3, but you get much more utility out of the three PS2 ROMs instead of the single PS3 HD collection disc. The same goes for playing Halo Anniversary on Xbox 360. You'll get much more fun out of just playing the original version on the original Xbox, and so on. One final pro tip to add here, it's essential to keep the PS3 ROMs split by region. So if you've got USA ROMs, have them in their own folder. Europe ROMs, have them in their own folder. You'll see why in video 16. All right, the Wii or anything else. Where possible, use anything else. Most Wii games were system exclusive. Those that weren't were almost always better on another system. The thing about Wii emulation, it can be very fiddly thanks to the unique way the controllers worked. It's much easier to avoid all that hassle. Just get a Wii game on a more conventional system if at all possible. You might find some games, like Epic Mickey 2 for example, are on both Wii and Wii U. In cases like that, you may want to have both ROMs as they work on different tiers of hardware. The Wii U one will be much easier to configure controls for though. Moving into the online ecosystem, Xbox Live Arcade versus PlayStation Network. This one's a little bit surprising, assuming you have a device like a Steam Deck running something like Batasera, and we'll talk all about that in a few videos time. Then emulating Xbox Live Arcade games is actually a lot easier than PlayStation Network games. PlayStation Network games is far from straightforward. What this means is where you have a digital exclusive game that's on both Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, I'd recommend getting the Xbox Live version every time. PS3 or PS Vita. PS Vita emulation is possible, but is very much in its infancy. Much like the Xbox 360, I'd recommend getting the ROMs for Vita exclusives like Uncharted Golden Abyss or things like that. But this is an investment for the future. For now, they aren't playable, so PS3 version of games like PlayStation All Stars Battle Royale would win every time. Just go for the PS3 version. Speaking of that version, let's look at PS3 and 360 again, but this time let's throw in Wii U into the mix because when you've got something that's across all three platforms, the Wii U bizarrely wins hands down. Whilst 360 games are essentially unplayable on the deck and only lower power PS3 games run well, the Wii U was such a lower powered console that actually most games run much better on the deck using this platform than they do in the PS3 version. It's weird, but true. As a pro tip, check and see if a PlayStation Network game you want is available on Wii U. Wii U eShop titles work really easily indeed, even easier than Xbox Live Arcade ones. So there's no harm in throwing Wii U titles into your build. Moving into the end of the Nintendo emulation, if you want to go down this route, there are quite a few 3DS and Wii U exclusive games that are great and can be emulated. However, most 3DS and Wii U games, even the ones that were exclusives, have now been re-released on the Switch. As such, given I don't emulate Switch games, I don't see a point in trying to emulate them. They exist in a convenient handheld form factor that already works, and I can just buy them there physically, to be honest. So that's genuinely what I do. What I would say is that if you are trying to emulate unique 3DS games, I would strongly recommend you try to get US versions of the 3DS ROMs. Much like the original Xbox, I'll explain why in video 16. Okay, and then the final list here, I'll just throw this up on the screen. These are systems that I basically simply leave alone. There's not really any good way to streamline their ROMs, as they all run pretty much unique games, unique to that particular hardware system, or unique versions of games. The ROM sizes for all of these is also very, very small. So any potential space saving gains by going through with a fine-tooth comb, it's marginal, it's tiny. So for all these, generally just leave them alone. You're not going to make a huge amount of savings for any of these, and they're all unique ROMs. Finally, and this is a random quirk, which like I said is kind of unique to something I spotted, and I definitely don't know anywhere else I ever came across this. Keep an eye on rogue mutant ROMs, which I found in everything from MAME ROM sets to GBA ROMs. And I'm going to insert a video that I filmed several months ago of how I spotted and handled an insane mutant ROM. So we're now looking into this weird ROM issue that I had with the Wii U. So if you recall, hopefully it's clear from however I put this video together, if I've made it, that when I was using RetroArch on the Wii U to scan my ROMs, it was finding random duplicates that weren't within my ROMs. So, for example, within my Game Boy Advance games, it found like 2 or 3 dozen duplicates. And as well as that, and a related issue, or maybe a distinct issue, it was finding the entire Game Boy Advance library so large that I had to split it into various chunks in order for it to be ingested. So that got me wondering, as you can see here, all my Game Boy Advance ROMs are zipped ROMs. And we'll talk about why it's important to keep them zipped in a second. But I thought maybe, as we've seen before in some arcade games, hopefully, um, maybe what's happened is that there's a couple of files inside each zip. So instead of being, for example, in this case, the Advance Wars ROM inside the zip file, maybe it's got 2 Advance Wars ROMs inside the zip file. Hopefully, I've already done a video on arcade ROMs and some of the weird and wonderful things I found inside zipped arcade ROMs. But if I haven't, just be aware that that can sometimes happen. If you find a rogue zipped ROM and you open it, instead of having one game in it, it might have 1 or 2 games in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through here and I'm going to go through the list that I made from the Wii U scraping to basically grab every single ROM here that is from a game that ended up turning up twice on the Wii. So, for example, we've got Advance Wars and Advance Wars 2. Each of those was visible twice on the Wii U RetroArch. And I've had this kind of duplicate issue in a couple of other places that I've ignored, but now it's got me thinking. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull all of these out, all the ones that are duplicate games. I'm going to pull them all out, and I'm going to have a look at exactly like what's inside them. Okay, so here are the 20 games that actually created 20 random duplicates on the Wii U. And so I'm going to go into each of these one by one to see what's going on. But just skimming over this, straight away, we can see a couple of odd things. Now, normally a GBA zipped game is like 5 meg, 10 meg. This one, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, is 3 gig, 2.94 gig. What the hell is going on there? Also, some of these seem a little bit large. So let's investigate what's happening here. To start off with, I'm going to have a look at Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, but I'm going to pull that into its own folder. Now, I've called this one Game Boy Advance Test Doubles. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put this into its own folder, which I'm just going to call Test 1. Okay, now we have this folder called Test 1. We've got Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. I'm just going to use 7-zip to open it up. Let's see what's in here. Okay, it's just the game. That's totally fair enough. One thing worth noticing is that actually the compression does quite help with Game Boy Advance file sizes. And as we'll see later on, for a lot of the games that are 2 or 3 mega zipped files, they're actually 8 or 9 meg as unzipped files. Now that doesn't seem like a lot, but cumulatively, over the size of an entire Game Boy Advance library of several hundred ROMs, that adds up to a good couple of gig. And in case you're wondering, it's no better or worse to have it zipped. All emulators that I've ever used can handle a zipped GBA file, no problem whatsoever. So you might as well keep it zipped and save yourself some memory. Okay, so it looks like this is just a randomly large game. So let's close it and go back to the doubles menu. Okay, so within this, again, we've got that weird anomaly there. We've also got Prisoner of Azkaban. I'm just going to quickly just unzip this here because I'm almost certain this is going to be pretty benign. And yeah, it is. It's just a large file. Okay, cool. Let's just get rid of that. I'm going to delete this elsewhere. Fantastic. So what is going on in this file? Okay, we've now moved Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, the American GBA ROM, into its own file, still called test1, as you can see here. And now we're going to open this. Now, I don't know what's in here, but I suspect there's more than just the Final Fantasy Tactics Advance ROM, because 3 gigs seems insanely large for a Game Boy Advance game. So let's just open it and see if there's a couple of other things in here. Okay, so what we're finding is there's actually hundreds and hundreds of files in here. This is crazy. Oh my God, this is crazy. So at this point, it's actually found the GBA file for Final Fantasy Tactic Advance. Um, yeah, this is it. So do I want to replace that zip file with the new zip file? I'll say yes, may as well. Yes to all. Well, just yes to this one. Oh my God. Oh my God. Already 300 GBA games in here. Right. Well, I think this explains the problem. My suspicion is that when the Wii U RetroArch was trying to scrape the games, as you may or may not know, what RetroArch does is it really quickly unzips the games and makes sure all the right things are in there. So, for example, for arcade games, it will unzip the zip file and make sure all the correct little sub files to run the arcade game are in there. Similarly, for something like a GBA zipped folder, it will unzip it and make sure the GBA ROM is there. In this case, it unzipped it and then it found several hundred ROMs. And so what I guess is that it then caused duplicates to be found and to be input. Okay, so within that one folder, that 3 gig folder, was 638 games. That is utterly astonishing. That explains quite a lot. Now, I guess my theory here is that only some of these led to duplicates. Now, I don't know why. I don't know why that's the case. I suppose what should have happened, this should have led to 638 duplicates, because I have obviously several hundred Game Boy Advance ROMs. But I assume what happened was when it was a case of, for example, Hot Potato USA version, if I had the USA version, it would have just, I guess, recognized it as just the one ROM. Whereas if I had the European version, it would probably have recognized it as two ROMs. That might explain that, but it's at best a guess. I think the important thing for me to keep in mind for you to be aware of here is that occasionally some of your ROMs will be rogue and the zipped folders will have all sorts of random stuff in them, 638 ROMs here, that the title would imply that they don't. So let's just scroll down and find our original ROM, which is here. As you can see, it has unzipped the actual GBA file, which is 16 meg, but the actual zipped folder we were starting with, 3 gig, clearly that shouldn't have been labeled Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. That is just some kind of Game Boy Advance library file. So that explains that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be deleting this from my ROM library and I'm getting a nice clean ROM dump of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, which I imagine will be something like 12 meg as a zipped folder. And not only will that save me 3 gig on my personal hard drive, this thing you see here called T7 Shield, not only will that save me 3 gig there, which is lovely, but also it means that when I do this in future, I won't be having this problem of finding hundreds of duplicates and confusing RetroArch and possibly crashing during that process. But let's look at the other games that also showed us having duplicates. I'm assuming it's all because of this one rogue folder, but let's double check that. Okay, we're back to the Game Boy Advance test doubles folder. These are all the folders we haven't as yet opened up. They all look relatively benign, but you know what? we have 17 games here. I'm going to unzip all 17 of them. And here we are. They've been unzipped. It took a little bit longer than I thought for some random reason. But let's have a look at this by type. So this is a really easy way to see whether or not there's anything unusual there. Here we've got the original 17 games, and they've unpacked into the 17.gba ROMs. And you can just count them here, 17 items selected. So as we can see, as unzipped items, it's 152 meg, and as zipped items is 87 meg. So honestly, you might as well just keep your Game Boy Advance ROM zipped. It'll save you 50% of the space. So you might as well do that. So clearly, none of these folders were problematic. None of them were causing issues. None of them were causing the duplicates to be seen. And so the issue clearly is with that one Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced folder. I was going to say ROM. It's not a ROM. It's a folder of almost 600 ROMs in there. Going back to this, again, it's really easy to see where you have this kind of weird anomaly. So you can see it here, 3 gig. But just out of curiosity, let's have a scan through and see if there's anything else here that just jumps out at us. I mean, to be honest, I never really look at the file size, I only look at the name and then see if they work. So I'd never noticed this before, but now I see it, it's blindingly obvious. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and let's just start looking out our way through. Let's see. Your good dry union, right? Okay, let's unzip this, see what's in here. Yep, that's fine. 32 meg versus 17 meg as a zip folder. That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, 11, 10, 13 meg games, these all seem relatively benign. These all seem non-problematic. I wouldn't really have any questions with any of these. I mean, you could unzip every single one of them and then re-zip them all back up if you wanted to be ultra cautious about it. But to be honest, I haven't found any of these problematic, so I'm not going to do that. But I guess just doing this and scrolling up here really just shows how glaringly obvious it is when there's that kind of issue and something specifically is so huge. And look at this, 3 million kilobytes. So on that note, I think that's the only anomalous one we can see here. He says just scrolling all the way to the top. A couple of like surprisingly small ones, 583 kilobytes and things like that. But there's nothing wrong with a file being too small. Oh, we've got an odd one here. Amazing virtual sea monkeys. Right. I think it's time to make a test 2 folder. Okay, this is our test 2 folder. Right. Half a gig for the amazing virtual sea monkeys. I don't believe that for a fucking second. All right, let's unzip this. So it's a zipped file within a zipped file. Let's see what's inside here. How meta are we going to go? Okay, so this has 102 zipped items inside it. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. So just to confirm, I had a folder which was 3 gig in size. Inside that folder there were 600 zipped folders once I unzipped it, and one of those zipped folders had another 100 zipped folders. That is just crazy. And some of these games we already saw one level above. So here's Final Fantasy 1, Final Fantasy 4 Advance, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance again. All of these were in the original 3 gig folder. That's absolutely crazy. Okay, just for the sake of thoroughness, let's have a quick look through. Obviously, this is the aberrant ROM. Let's keep on scrolling through. Yeah, nothing else unusual there. How crazy is that? That's absolutely wild. Um, So that's something I just wanted to show you. Occasionally, if you find that RetroArch is finding loads of duplicates and you can't work out why, it might be because it's looking through the zip folders to the contents within and finding stuff. Obviously, in this case, it was looking into a zip folder marked Final Fantasy, finding 600 folders, and in one of those zip folders, it was finding these 100 folders. Thankfully, it seems that none of these have got zipped folders inside them, but it's a really important tip, I suppose. When you're going through your ROMs, just look through for any anomalous sizes, because it might be that someone, for some reason, is hiding hundreds of ROMs within another ROM. Okay, hopefully that was useful. That is the end of this video. I guess the one thing that I would just say is that when you're going through your ROM library, it's easy to go down the rabbit hole, and it's fun to go down the rabbit hole, to be honest, to go down the obsessive compulsive, I'm going to fine tune my ROM library perfectly, etc., etc. Um, but it is worth it, as you just saw from that mutant ROM that I just dissected on the Game Boy Advance. It's an admittedly painstaking process, but it's definitely worth doing a manual human eye review of your ROM library to spot any anomalies like this. That's why I don't use the eager process or the one game, one ROM process. The key thing for all of this sort of stuff is to fuck around and find out. It's the best way to learn, and it's the best way to deal with weird anomalies that no one else will have ever prepared you for, like mutant ROMs. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching. Drop some comments down below, let me know what you think. And in the next video in this series, I'm going to talk, again, it's going to be a slightly abstract video, but I'm going to be talking about backlog anxiety. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time and stay classy.